Okay, so I guess then I'll move on to authorship guidelines. I have just a few slides on that. Authorship guidelines. Who should be an author and what order should they be? In particular, it comes down to submitting to a journal. This is something where, at least for medical journals anyway, there are a set of very widely agreed on criteria. Now, how easy they are to apply is something else. At least everyone's working off of generally the same rules, and that's the guidelines here from the ICMJE, which I'll just read them out here, requires that an author makes a substantial contribution to conception, design, or acquisition, analysis, interpretation of data, and they've drafted or critically revised the manuscript and given approval for publication and agrees to be accountable for the work. So those last two basically don't require any actual work. So the real sort of focus on who's an author comes around the first two, right? And so, it's hopefully clear enough that there's some contribution towards either the conception or design of the work, or something around the data analysis, right? So one or the other, or both. And also some kind of work on the manuscript, whether it's initial drafting or critically revised. So, I think the place maybe where you fall down a bit is that, what actually constitutes a substantial contribution, right? And of course, that is entirely up to the interpretation. It's maybe instructive to think about the ways where this can go wrong, which would be either you are not crediting someone who should be credited, right? You might call that ghost authorship, or crediting someone who has perhaps not done enough to be credited, which we might call gift authorship. And I think one is clearly more problematic than the other, right? That being that obviously you don't want to be leaving people out. This is particularly relevant in, when you're working with students, as there's lots of sort of classic terrible examples of students being left off work that they've contributed to. But in terms of what actually makes a substantial contribution, if there is some modicum of, they somehow interpreted the data and critically offered comments on a manuscript, is that enough for authorship? I mean, this is a place where particularly as in acting as a supervisor, you probably have some judgment calls to making on that. And so while we in general, gift authorship is a thing where you sometimes may want to put a senior researcher on a manuscript. In general, it's a place where I think this gift authorship is a place where some people get added to a manuscript for not doing any work at all, and ultimately that becomes detrimental to the field in general. But you don't want to stop that either from being strategic and bringing people along who may be able to offer some very sort of high-level advice to the manuscript in general, even if they've not really been intricately involved in the development of the project. So the guidelines on authorship order are actually not quite as clear, and certainly they may vary a little bit by field, and even by institutions may interpret things differently. But typically multiple authorship is of course the norm outside of perhaps some methodological studies. And typically in medical research, and again, I can't really speak to what goes on perhaps in some more basic sciences, but typically the first author is the one who has made the largest contribution. Largely, they've been responsible for sort of driving the project forward, right? Taking that sort of leadership role, and have probably substantially drafted the manuscript. The last author typically is the supervisor, a head of lab, or the PI. So again, in a research supervision context, normally, hopefully the authorship order should be fairly clear between first and senior. And then other people in between those two are typically middle authors. And often the second author typically signifies perhaps the most contribution out of all the middle authors. That may not always be true. There was a useful study there that I've linked that looked at, I believe it was the Lancet, JAMA, BMJ, and CMAJ during years in which authors had to submit statements of contribution. And they basically just collated all those and saw, well, how much contribution was sort of relative contribution was being done by the various authors, and found that first was the most, followed by last, followed by second, and then everyone else sort of meshed together in the middle. So hopefully it's, in these contexts, it's fairly clear that if you're working with a student or a resident or a trainee, and they are, substantially driving the work forward, even whether or not the idea wasn't, the original idea may or may not have been entirely their inception, that they would be first off. And that, of course, is really important for the students, for their own development, for their own careers. And that as a supervisor, you would be taking the senior role. Sometimes in very large projects, you might see a PI taking first authorship. Particularly, I think when you have like tons of authors, and this distinction between first and senior may get confused there. But I think for most of sort of student projects, it should be fairly straightforward. As for the middle authors and sort of figuring out where they go, that's probably not as consequential. Again, I think second author can possibly be reserved for the person who makes, if there's a person who makes significantly more contributions. Otherwise, either try to figure out relative contributions, although I think, again, for middle authors, it's kind of hard to figure out, who really did more, and does it even matter? Or you can just go with alphabetical order, sort of for all the for everyone who's in the middle there. So around author order, I think it's great to set those expectations early, and we'll speak of this a bit more when it comes down to talking about the supervisory relationship. But yeah, getting a sense of with your student or trainee that if you're driving the work forward, the student is, I should say, that they can expect to be first author on that. As we said, normally you'd expect for student-led, student-driven work, the student is in first, and the supervisor is taking the last spot. There is such a thing as joint first authorship. I've certainly seen this and read about it. I've never been involved with it myself. I wonder if I can stop for a minute here and ask Andrew, do you have any opinion on joint first authorship and sort of how that's perceived?
It's usually the case, I've noticed, where two students contribute equally to a project. It's largely group oriented. Mm-hmm. And so it's usually not the case where it's a supervisor and a student, although it might be true in some fields. Usually if it's supervisor and a student, it's always seemed to me would be too tedious, because last authorship would be reserved in that case for the supervisor or the student, and it's pretty much the same meaning.
Yeah, for sure. And there's one example I'm thinking of in my head where I know it was it was here at McMaster, and it was a prominent member of at McMaster, and I know it was student and supervisor together in first author, and I don't, that's maybe a little confusing. I also know there's an extremely long author list of about 40 people, so potentially I feel like some of these large projects in which you might expect the supervisor to take first author, maybe that can happen. I think, I think in general, you're looking at, you're probably avoiding that. Because then, you say joint first, but someone's name still has to be first, right? And if people don't, and normally this joint first is signified by some sort of asterisk, which people aren't even going to notice when they're looking at the paper. So, enough on that. The other issue to consider when you're looking at authorship is deciding who the corresponding author should be, and this is not necessarily as clear. I think the way to think about this is sort of practically. If someone's going to pick up your paper 5 years from now and want to email a question about it, who's the best person to answer that, right? And this may depend on whether or not, as a supervisor, this particular project is really sort of fits into sort of your area of research, right? This is sort of part of a program that you're in, that you're developing, and sort of 5 years from now, it's going to make sense, right? That this is part of your research, and these emails are coming to you because you're still around, right? Versus if a project is maybe potentially the particular inception and genesis from the student, and this is a student wanting to develop their own research program, and this is sort of the start of their work, in which case, 5 years down the road, it may make sense for those inquiries to go to the student. So I think there's a little more thought around that of sort of whose research program are we really sort of looking at here, and sort of whose initial inception was this. I think people look at corresponding author and they probably think that it does offer some more prestige in terms of the author list. I don't know that I've necessarily seen it that way, or that it should, but I think inevitably that happens. just as a final note there, it's probably true for most places that this sort of gift and growth authorship are both against the research integrity policy. I don't know, as I said before, I think that gift authorship is less of an issue than sort of ghosting out students. But it's generally, if you're ensuring that your student is getting first authorship in those places where it's appropriate, and if you have a student you're working with who's contributing but not in a sort of a leading sense, then a middle authorship would make sense. But if they are really driving the work forward, then really that lead spot should be reserved for them. So that's my slides on that. I don't know if anyone has any comments or stories they want to share. My only example really of authorship conflict in my not very long career as a researcher, honestly, has been it was around second authorship. There was a middle author who wanted to be second author instead of third. And that might seem a little petty, and it kind of did to me at the time. But, frankly, the sense of who really contributed more between second and third is kind of difficult to really determine. So I was honestly happy to switch. I don't think the other person minded at all. But hopefully, if you can sort of agree, set expectations early on for first and last, and the only conflicts you end up with are potentially middle authors complaining that they got third or fifth instead of third or something, which is really not that much of a conflict, honestly. At least it shouldn't be.
In here for a second.
Go ahead, Sunil.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, having done this with students, the first and last, the first part is very easy. Whoever's the person driving the work, like you said, is the winner. But I would agree that setting the expectations, that point on author order early is really important. Another thing that works well, I've been involved with some other bigger projects where I'm kind of a peasant in the middle, which is fine. I don't care. Usually it's alphabetical, right? Infinity -1, I'll take it, especially if it's going to go to BMJ or Lancet or something like that.
Right.
As long as I'm on the front page and not in the small italics on the back page, then I'm good with that, right?
Right.
However, if there's a project that is big in scope and it's actually generating a lot of side projects and subgroup analyses and stuff like that, one thing that can work nicely is that each student or participant takes one section of that multi-pronged study, and then they're the lead author on that paper. So then everybody gets a rotating authorship as long as they're contributing to each of the subgroup projects, then the overall group project, of course, and so on and so forth. So that's a strategy that tends to work nicely if the project lends itself to such a thing, right?
Yeah, that's great when that can happen. Just so you're saying that reminded me, sometimes you're not really looking at journal articles and more sort of posters or presentations. And again, if that's a place where you sometimes get multiple students contributing more or less equally, there's a spot where they can sort of switch, first authorship on a poster this conference versus that, or a poster or presentation. And that's a great chance for, for them to take some sort of leadership. At least, well, I mean, they've already really taken leadership, but to sort of get more acknowledged of that, right? When you can flip that up. For journal articles, of course, that's not really going to be able to happen because it's a different study. But at least for posters and that, at least that's possible.
There's one more idea we're exploring in Niagara, and we tried in Hamilton. Is one thing that's driven me nuts for almost 20 years now with supervising research projects, is the lack of what I call legacy planning, which is, where does the project go next when a student is finished and they're done and they graduate on and off they go? And many projects, they sort of die after one thing. So what we're trying to do is with legacy plans is, look, the student who finished this phase of the project, you're first. But if there's a junior student or a junior learner who's attached to that project and they're going to take the next step to the next step and to the next step and next step, then they'll be first on that one, and so on and so on, right? So as you recruit junior learners into the ongoing projects, they will eventually be a senior author or a primary author on something. So we're not there yet, but it is an enticement that we're trying to think about, at least in Niagara.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's great.
Yeah, and then it builds the longevity of a quality improvement plan that'll go on for years, and the students just cycle in and out, but the lead faculty are always involved, or whoever, and that's fine. They're generally going to be in the anchor position anyway, based on your comments, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, I would offer one thing, which is, if you were going to take the advice of some greats in the field, for us at McMaster University, it's always been David Sackett. He's written wonderfully on mentorship. You should check it out. And copious stuff that he's written, even talks you can find. And, basically his overall theme was be generous to students. And I can tell you that it's definitely a good idea. Number one, as a senior investigator, your academic promotion is not really dependent on first author or last author. It's viewed the same in terms of at the end of the day, or at least it is in my institution. And in fact, to the extent that you're fair and generous with those that are on your research projects, your students, et cetera, you will only get more and more productive students coming your way because the word spreads. And to the extent that you're not fair, you will suffer as a result. That's absolutely the case. And so always lean towards generosity, I would say. If it matters more for them, give up first authorship, even if you rewrote the whole thing. Take last author.
We're having a fantastic discussion, but we are aware that we are a few minutes behind our schedule, so we'll try and get through as much as we can.
What about matchmaking? I've worked with many students and supervised many so far, and it's always something that among individuals, all of us who supervise students, we discuss because we have successes and we also all have failures. And so how should you approach students that you would supervise? I have some general advice. And this works, I think, for small and large projects, whether you're getting a federally funded cross-national project or whether you're doing something that's of interest that you're doing on the side of your desk that you're not funded to do. I think the ingredients are really always the same. Number one, genuine interest and commitment. Whether it's funded or whether it's unfunded, whether it's small, whether it's large, at the end of the day, it's something that's going to bear on your mind. There are going to be challenges that you have to overcome, things you would be unaware of in the beginning, and you're going to have to live with it. And so that you're genuinely interested and committed to the project is great. It's generally a bad idea to take on things that are good opportunities in terms of they could be good projects, or you think they could be good projects, or someone's offering some dollars to do it or suggesting you should take it on. If it's not something that's a genuine interest and you have genuine commitment to it, it's going to fall apart, quite honestly. And it might actually lead you down a path where you keep doing projects in an area you're not that interested in. It'll be pretty soul-sucking, I think. Realistic project scope and timeframes. In all of our lives, we probably have expectations that are probably not very realistic of ourselves, right? And you probably have some rules of thumb, which is if you're planning something, calculate 3 times more than how long you think it will take. And that's generally the case with research projects. They tend to go sideways, expand in scope, have unforeseen issues. And so always start off from a very realistic perspective around what you're doing and the timeframes. Don't overcommit yourself. Set an expectation. Have the necessary mentorship, support, and resources, but recognize that you're ultimately on your own. You don't have to be the be-all and end-all of every project and know every in and out of every single component that you're planning. It's okay to have mentorship and support. And for students that are doing projects under you, to expect you to have mentorship and support or have access to resources. But if you're too dependent on that mentorship and support and those resources, then to that extent, things could fall apart pretty quickly, and you are ultimately on your own. Because usually the individuals or the resources that you're hoping to get some support from, they're stretched as well, and they might not be there when you need them exactly as you need them. And to have control of the timelines and the work schedule of the project you're pursuing. You can't be totally dependent on others. To the extent that you don't control some of the levers in the project or the important ones, and you're waiting on others to fulfill things, your project will suffer. You won't have as much fun. Things will go sideways, and it won't work out. Team-based projects usually work very well, whether you're doing big projects or small projects, because where you automatically include the individuals, you include the incentives of the individuals who are providing you support and resources. Everyone's achieving their objectives in the project. To the extent that you have that alignment, usually you get all 1, 2, 3, and 4 on that list together, all in one. You're having fun together. It's realistic because you're working together. You've got a lot of mentorship and support and different capacities in the team. And together you have control of your timelines. What students come with often And it's very variable, I'll tell you. Definitely time and energy. And so they have time, they have the energy, they have the youthful ignorance that is very much required and crucial to research. And if you're not a little bit ignorant, it's tough to do research, honestly. I have heaps of ignorance, which gets me into doing things that I always think afterwards, wow, that was probably unadvised, but it was a lot of fun and a lot of work. And they have this energy and time to be able to pursue this that you might not have as a mentor or not in the same way. They may come with research and content expertise. Either works. If you're working with medical students or you're working with a graduate student, oftentimes they'll come with graduate level research. Some of them will. They'll come with technology experience. They might come with skills and interests that may surprise you that would be very, very instructive towards a project. You know, including a student who's extremely good at coding and software development. They might be able to design a very good, very high-end data collection tool for the project. And that might be what they bring. Access to research resources. Oftentimes, if you're working with students, they come with advanced knowledge of data collection tools, institutional software, sometimes biostatistical support through their departments, presentation templates, the kinds of things otherwise you might not know that you have access to, except that you do if you're working with students that are pursuing research. And a means to get the work out. Oftentimes students come or have access to very easy sources of funding that you won't have access to go and present at a conference. You'll pay your own bill, but they oftentimes won't because there's all kinds of student bursaries available. As well, sometimes they get discounts on publication fees to the extent that they're the first author and the work is otherwise unsupported. It's very expensive to publish these days. Open access has become a normal sort of thing, but it's hugely expensive. It's not, some people are not paying that because they might get exemptions because it's a student-led project or otherwise there isn't support for it. You can always ask. And students kind of bring that. They also sometimes get data very cheap. I know in data platforms that I run at McMaster University, graduate students don't pay for access. But don't abuse it where, you know, it's actually your work, but it's the students.
Hey, you keep the graduate student forever so you can keep getting free data access, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Don't ever let them graduate.
But if you're not an independent researcher, you're a clinician scientist doing it on the side of your desk, there are all kinds of opportunities brought to you because students are involved in your projects. And you might not think so because they can get access to research data platforms that you wouldn't have access to otherwise or be unaware of. So allow them to think creatively. You should think creatively. They bring a lot to the table. When approached, though, the things you should ask yourself: do you want to work with them? And so it's a personality factor because you'll be spending a lot of time together. And if just personality-wise, there isn't the kind of productive relationship that you think you'd like, you know, and it's not necessarily a fault of any one individual, that's something to really consider. If somebody comes with a huge number of skills, but you just don't think you really connect very well, it's generally not advisable to pursue it. Sometimes that will get you into some issues around conflicts, et cetera, expectations. If you can't have those discussions, it's very difficult. When you work with somebody, you're kind of, you're being a mentor to them, usually outside of just doing research. And so wanting to sort of see them through, really being in their corner is really important. Understand, why is a student motivated to do this, particularly if they're coming to you either as a graduate student or actually as a medical student. I always keep this in mind. Is it a genuine interest and curiosity? Can they jive and tell me about why they're interested in it? Is it a personal experience? Or is it strictly for career advancement? You know, I don't think it's generally not a good idea, I've found, to take on students that are strongly doing research as a career advancement exercise and don't have any genuine interest. They're not curious. Usually it'll end up in failure for both of you, and you wouldn't have done them a favor by taking them on and trying to move things along. Do they have the skills to complete the work? And in particular, how do you know that? Can they show evidence from previous experience? What have they done in the past to showcase that they can get the work done that they're proposing to do, or the work that you need done, or the skills that you know are required to do the project? If they can't, again, it's usually not a good idea to proceed, even though you might like them and they might be motivated. So the first two might be there, but the third might not. Lastly, are they prioritizing their project, or are they stretched between many projects? You don't do them a favor by inviting them to take on one more thing if they can't complete the previous. And so maybe you might be able to help them prioritize so they can be successful. I'll give you some of my own tips, and then maybe you could share your own. I assess motivation, and I avoid those who are seeking outputs. I think I already said that. You know, if I say, oh, why do you want to do this? Well, I'd like to publish a paper. That's a bad start. That's only the output of a longer process in an interest. And publications come when you're doing good work and you're having fun doing it. It's not the ends that justify the means, in my view. That's my philosophy. You might think differently, and that's totally fine. But that's what jives with me. Those that want to be competitive for a specialty, you know, that doesn't turn me on and make me want to stay up till 1 o'clock in the morning reading something and trying to get something through. I don't know about you. Is it a good fit? Could the project use their specific skill or their time? Can they work pretty independently? Are they self-motivated? And oftentimes, how do I know that? I'll establish a little bit of a litmus test. And I know others that have done this, and this has been shared to me by senior colleagues of mine, which is where they think it works, they'll ask something time limited, not that goes on forever, you can't abuse this relationship, to assess if the student can meet an expectation. So you'll give them a task that's towards completing this project, like, can you give me a one-pager? If they have a project idea, can you give me a one-pager of the idea? What's your research question? How are you going to do it? Can you go and read the literature and tell me what's been done? If they can't get it done in a time frame that you think is kind of reasonable, or to a quality that's reasonable, something's wrong there, and definitely don't proceed. So if you have any of your own thoughts on that, I mean, feel free to share them as well.